Hello and welcome to the Smug Europeans podcast. We still don't have a better name than that. Today, my partner in crime, Pascal Emmanuel Gobry, can't join me. He is out there aggrandizing his house, France, and I suppose Christendom. So he will tell us about his adventures next week. But I took the opportunity, therefore, to invite one of my good friends, Nathan Pinkowski, to join the podcast and to talk about the thing with which, in fact, we started this podcast a couple of months back. Jean Raspail, The Camp of the Saints, recently translated again into English, and a succès de scandale in America, very well deserved. Hopefully, it will be as big a success in Europe, and which comes with an introduction by none other than Nathan. So thanks very much for joining me, Nathan. I think it's the first time we actually do a podcast together, even though we've known each other years. We meet at NatCons and other events. We have common friends like the Claremont Institute, and yet we haven't had the opportunity for a conversation before. So I'm very glad to have that opportunity and the conversation. But since it is the first time, please introduce yourself for our audience.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Indeed, it's long overdue, so I'm sure it'll be a great deal of fun. So I'm Nathan Pinkowski. I'm not a European, though I spent my 20s in Europe. So you shouldn't think that counts, though. European identity, of course, is far deeper, runs much more than that. But it allows me perhaps to be a fellow traveler, to say the least. And I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Renewing America, based in the US, though I grew up in Canada. And much of my intellectual training in Europe at Oxford was in political theory. So I've dabbled in political theory for most of my adult life, and then have an interest in French political thought, which I have written about. And that's my claim to fame here, is that last week I was, for a brief moment, a banned writer because of my writings on Jean Raspail. I wrote the introduction for the new translation that Ethan Rundell did for a small publishing company, as our viewers may know, called Vauban Books, which was only founded a few years ago, but had acquired the rights to issue a new edition of The Camp of the Saints. And so here we are.
Well, and here's to Vauban Books. It's very good that this thing actually got done. The there are a lot of things that I would like to get to, and maybe the overall theme would be something that we take to heart: the need for a renewed Franco-American friendship, more on the right as opposed to perhaps previous love affairs of the American and French left or whatnot. But to start with, you became a band writer. It was brief but eventful, exciting. Perhaps it made you feel young again. Tell us about it.
Yes. So basically, what happened is Vauban Books' new edition had been getting some more attention in the legacy media. There'd been a couple larger, some fair pieces. There was a very fair essay written in the Atlantic, a mainstream position, but a fair criticism nevertheless. And that had happened a few months ago, and that seemed to have created a chain whereby other publications had picked up on it. Le Monde had picked up on it. Le Grand Continent had written a very long hit piece in which there were two pieces and they had to remove one because they were publishing sections without authorization, so they were in violation of intellectual property laws, to say nothing of other ones. And the result was that the sales for the book had actually been increasing. Vauban is very small. It only has a couple books in its print line, and it speaks actually out of the larger ecosystem to you, which you just referred, or rather the lack of it. The sense that if we are leftist hegemony that controls much of the way we even define not only ourselves and our own national traditions, but the international, the relationships between them, then you're going to have to build new institutions. And Vauban was a step in this direction to try to bring some writers back into print, writers of the right, but also writers of the left who didn't make the mainstream. And so the publishing company had put the book out and been doing rather well, climbing up in the ranks, but had attracted the attention of the powers that be. And so last week, the paperback edition, which was the one that had an uptick in sales, was unceremoniously pulled, and this is really just to stress for our viewers. This can really be a death blow for a large publishing operation, but definitely a small one, because so many Amazon controls most of the market. So many publishing companies relate and get their data from Amazon. So if you lose your Amazon listing, it affects you in other domains as well. So there was a real risk for Vauban that this would snuff out its line. And so when Vauban received the official notice from Amazon last Monday, and it had said your content has been removed for violating our offensive policies, that sort of thing. They have the full statement of that. And they posted it online kind of as a protest, but didn't really expect much to happen because what can one do, especially if one's a small publishing company? But fortunately, it ended up getting a lot of traction. And I think Amazon was embarrassed by their decision. And by the end of the day, they had said, oh, it was all a mistake and all an error, and your listing's back up. And then as things go with this, the sales kept climbing and climbing. And so last week it ended the week top five in best-selling books on Amazon US. So in the whole US market, it had hit top five, and I think it's still in the top 100. I haven't checked it in the past few days, but I think it's still up there, top 100 sales of all books. So a very impressive performance overall. It's done very good things for Vauban, simply because it's a small publishing house, basically unheard of, and now has brought it forward. And then, of course, by my own self-interest, more people are reading my introduction to the book. So very happy to have that. I doubt I'll be a household name anytime soon, but it's nice to see attention to what one writes, especially when it's a more academic exercise or more theoretical exercise, which is basically what my introduction was trying to provide: the intellectual background, the history of Raspail's work, and a couple guiding points to understand the book and how it fit in Raspail's whole oeuvre.
Yeah, maybe that's one odd thing that this used to be part of cultural, intellectual, public life, academics, critics, literature. It didn't used to, or not recently at any rate, didn't used to involve this sort of notion of turning somebody into an enemy and trying to destroy him. The strange combination of blaming something and therefore attracting attention to it, and trying to get institutions and technology and ideology to synchronize so that you can shut it out at the same time. That
Yeah,
it's one of the paradoxes of our time that we in a certain sense behave like mid-century liberals. There are controversial ideas, let's talk about them. And on the other hand, our counterparts behave with this crazy censorship that, on the one hand, you're supposed to condemn as evil, sweet guys like you or Ethan and so on at Vauban. But on the other hand, you're supposed to not even know what it is that you are condemning.
yeah,
It's evil enough to condemn, but also evil that you can't even talk about it. And and if that weren't odd enough, it's even stranger because Jean Raspail had a great number of adventures and novels, and therefore fictional adventures. He was a sort of very late romantic novelist who would not seem to attract too much public attention, much less the kinds of cultural or controversies that this gins up. And furthermore, he was incredibly respected among French novelists. He was a shoe-in for the Academy, although he was not ultimately voted in. He won impressive awards. It was simply understood that this is beautiful writing, and that the haunting quality of his stories of worlds falling apart, of the end of ways of life, and then the necessity of commemorating it in art is a worthwhile human endeavor that he pursued much better than most. It was never particularly to the taste of even French literary elites, but they had a kind of confidence and generosity and power of admiration as well that made his career not only possible, but uh, something beyond that. He was applauded. It was a success. There
Yeah.
was he was not a tolerated figure, something that you could ban or unban or end up in these odd edge cases of our new neurotic techno-ideological glitches. And, and so somehow that suggests both that we would like to return to something that was more human, but also that we have to push forward through some kind of crazy thing that's still happening that we
Yeah.
associate with COVID and so forth, these sorts of ideological pushes for censorship, but that are still
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
And they have this odd character that Amazon can try to destroy your entire business and then say, it's a mistake, backseas. We take it back.
Yeah.
Very odd, junior high drama, but with these other kinds of repercussions, with these other kinds of stakes. There's something
Yeah.
deeply infantile about this behavior, and presumably that's part of the attraction. You can try to destroy this business and the novel success, and you might succeed. Amazon, as you say, has enormous power. There's something like 80% of the book market. It's just huge for sales. But on the other hand, you can always say we didn't mean it. We did not mean it. It was an accident. This was a technical problem. It was just a difficulty in the algorithm. The bot picked
Yeah.
it up somehow. If you succeed in destroying something, you get a certain kind of satisfaction. Perhaps if you win an ideological battle, you can brag about your progressive morality. But if it fails and you just have to unban a novel, as happened in your case, in the case of the Camp of the Saints, you could always say this was a technical glitch. We didn't mean it.
Yeah.
There's a weird combination of claims of progressive morality, and on the other hand, a defense based on saying, after all, technology isn't perfect. Sometimes there are mistakes. It's
Yeah.
very weird.
So
Ideology must always be right. Technology can sometimes get it wrong, and you have to change. What are you gonna do?
yeah.
It's a new version of what we used to call in politics plausible deniability.
Yes.
But it also shows at the same time this enormous risk to this kind of system of censorship. As you're saying, suddenly the book becomes popular. This has been the theme of my NatCon speeches, and people who have followed my work know I worked with Chris Rufo on this.
Hmm.
There's a growing number of us who believe that success is on the other side of scandal. You have to embrace the scandal. And in the case of Obama books, these are nice people who never looked for trouble, but trouble found them. And it turns out, are you getting struck by lightning or are you catching lightning and they caught lightning? So it's great for the guys, for Ethan and Louis,
Yeah.
and hopefully this is not just a flash in the pan to switch metaphors here on you. Hopefully this will lead to more interest. That suddenly people realize there's something that was forbidden and therefore has to be talked about, but it turns out it can't quite be forbidden. So maybe there's a power to it that is bigger, or at least in a human order, more impressive than whatever it is that ideology and algorithms can do for Amazon.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is the thing that I would like to get to, or this is what I'd like to ask you about. Suddenly people start buying this, suddenly people are talking about it. We're trying to help this along. People realize that something is happening here. What could be better than this attempt at technological ideological sync to destroy the human spirit? There
Hmm.
must be something to it. There must be something that made Jean Raspail dedicate his career to strange, adventurous novels and this world in Europe, in the Americas, North and South America, in the past, in imagination, talking about the end of the world and the need to commemorate it. There's something about that sort of romantic imagination that is very important. There's something about the power of fantasy to overcome the march of history, or at least to
Yeah.
lodge in minority opinion that somehow counts. Without that, we would not have had this much of an opportunity to fight back. There would not be enough of an audience. To some
Yeah.
extent, we all depend on spreading news of the scandal when it happens. It's not up to us to choose when somebody tries to destroy some book we love or some artist we like or a writer. And then we try to play defense. And in some cases, like this one, it looks like we win. All of a sudden, people realize we could live another life. We could do things differently. Strangely enough, the saga of the banning and unbanning is, like a spy story, but with more of a happy end than most of them actually have.
Yeah, yeah, he's quite a pessimistic writer. Yeah.
Exactly. So,
Well,
since this was also the theme of your introduction, his work as a whole and his reflection on the transformations of modern history on multiple
yeah,
continents,
yeah.
please
Well,
talk about him.
yeah, I think that's exactly right. First of all, that we have this strange apparatus which is still in existence, and you're right, I think, to draw attention to COVID, to the kind of institutional apparatus that developed that really came to a crescendo during that time, where it's partly a blend of the progressive ideology, but also these technological tools of control. Indeed, perhaps the two are co-determinants. We can't think of progressivism without the desire to develop this technologies of control, and the technologies of control reinforce progressivism. And yeah, it's not quite perfect. And this is a funny incident. Oh, well, in the sense, a comic incident, in the sense that, as you say, it has a happy ending for those who are trying to sell books, to promote neglected authors. I imagine that there are many people who did not know that this novel existed, or did not know of Raspai or his broader work, and now have had that on their radar because of the kinds of attention that it's been given in the past week. So all that is very good. And then the irony is that it does draw back to a theme in Raspai's work, and I think a theme of many mid 20th century writers who do take a more pessimistic strand, and why their perspective is particularly valuable. Their pessimism arises. I think indeed I think there are two sources for it. One is one I think we should remind ourselves, particularly for American listeners, the European experience of the Second World War was one of deep ruin, and in many countries, civil war. You can't really understand France's experience in the war unless you understand that it ended in 1944 with effectively a kind of civil war where only one side was allowed to fight, which was a brutal part of it. And the effort is a commendation to someone like de Gaulle, his effort to try to conceal that and rebuild a national project, and to say there was a prospect of national renewal, how audacious it was, and also how, for a time, how successful it was. That success should not allow us to neglect or disregard just how destructive the war was, and why many people who were shaped by that took out of it a very pessimistic lesson about which direction civilization was going in. An English equivalent of this would be Evelyn Waugh, I think, would be a writer who has a similar mark. If you read the Sword of Honor trilogy, it's also marked by the sense that the war does not have the Hollywood outcome as it does in the US, where you kind of land on the beaches, fight your way, a long, hard, brutal fight, but it's over by 1945. That's the story that many people tell or think about the Second World War. If you take the American perspective, that it's sort of like a sports match. You go over there, you fight it, and then you're in Berlin and you've beaten the Nazis. Incidentally, it also sets aside in the imaginary the more brutal experience in the Pacific Front, which is another question too, about how our imaginary of the Second World War takes on an optimistic character and not and plays down some of the more brutal elements, or indeed elements like the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But that pessimism, that I think, is something that a lot of the best European writers have coming from the Second World War, and it marks their way of thinking. And Raspail is a good example of that, of someone who's marked by that. And the second side of it is what you said, the technological side. It's the sense that you link this to a broader civilizational shift, really and perhaps an anti-civilizational shift, an embrace of, uh, of a technological force that has a homogenizing conformance pressure and shapes everything to become effectively the same. You know, Raspail, he won the T.S. Eliot Award in the 1990s and delivered a speech about this, where he said, I'm a friend of America, but we need to understand that a lot of this pressure comes from the United States. And we have to be able to reckon with this pressure, because we in Europe, we need you, but in an important way, you're also the source of the thing that's destroying us. So he says that as a friend of America, but he draws attention to that force. Uh, and and his response as a writer, there are different responses you could take, I think. You know, another writer we could throw on the table is Ernst Junger, who I think is also marked by this experience. Takes a slightly different path, though. But Raspail's experience or way of responding is a romantic one. It's what do we mean by romanticism here? I mean a kind of yearning for a lost unity, a sense that there's something fragile that we have to take up and transmit as best we can. And so, what he celebrates in his work, whether it be native populations that are struggling to survive, whether it be in the black comic elements of Camp of the Saints, a group that's trying to pass on and hold on to a French political community, even though the odds are stacked against them. Whichever work we look at, what he really admires is this nobility of transmission. Those who transmit, those who take up that task are to be admired. Those who succumb, whether it be for cowardice or who are seduced by the technological pressures of late modernity to give up what is distinct and become the same, those are the ones that he has scorn for as a writer, and that's part of what I think people respected and admired about his voice in the 80s and 90s when he won a number of prizes. And just by the way, he although he didn't make it into the Académie Française, lost. He needed a two-thirds majority to get in. He only got the majority. He did win their highest literary prize, the Grand Prix de la Littérature Française, um, which l'Académie issues every year and had been given in the past to people like Jacques Maritain, Marguerite Yourcenar, the author of The Memoirs of Hadrian, a beautiful book if no one has read it or if our viewers haven't heard about it. Wonderful novel about Hadrian. And Yourcenar, I think, was Belgian, not French, but beautiful writer, beautiful little book. So people admired that and appreciated that kind of romanticism, and thought that even if the plot elements of Comte Saint of Camp of the Saints had been something that they disagreed with, they could still appreciate that. I went back the other day and looked at the review the New York Times did, and it speaks to your comment about there being an older kind of liberal literary culture that conservatives are paradoxically defending now. So in 1975, I believe, New York Times did review the book. And the reviewer admitted he hadn't read any of his other works, which is perhaps start of a bad trend where things start to go wrong. But it's not a review that is a screed or a kind of effort to expose his moral crimes or something like that. It's a review that is thinks the central premise is preposterous, in the words of the reviewer, um, and kind of makes fun of him a bit, but it's still treated seriously as a work. It's a negative review, but it's still making it into the pages of the New York Times. And incidentally, National Review also reviewed it, favorable review at the time, and you could refer to it in the 1990s without too much controversy. Samuel Huntington notes it briefly in Clash of Civilizations. The Atlantic, worth looking at the cover of the Atlantic from December 1995. I doubt it would pass muster today, where the two historians, Matthew Connolly and Paul Kennedy, where they have a review where they treat the book, uh, discussing as part of a broader essay on the challenges facing the West, but they refer to the book and discuss it there. So there is this older climate that existed, and works like this could be discussed, debated. Maybe you would deem it, take a very critical stance, maybe be favorable, but it's I think a testament to the kind of intellectual environment that lived for some time, but now has largely broken down. I wouldn't say it's infantile though. You said it's a kind of infantilism. I think it's a pursuit of respectability that has cursed a lot of us. And that's meant that what that does is that destroys our more philosophic spirit. It requires us to evacuate that. And that is, alas, the state of the most of the institutions in which we're supposed to learn the spirit of inquiry, or however you want to call it. That project has been captured or redirected towards the pursuit of respectability. That's what you go to university to do. You go to university to get a degree, to learn how to be respectable, and the degree is a sign of that so that you can advance your way up the managerial classes so people know that your views are respectable. That's the American way for higher education, and it's just been that, and that's the model that other countries have adopted and pushed forward. So here we are, in effect, we're in that world where we chase respectability, and when we talk about free speech or something like that, sometimes it's a kind of pious bromide that we don't necessarily believe, or believe only in the abstract, or when we get it, and this is perhaps the challenge that faces people who, when they have we get it, we don't really know what to do with it. So we're in it. We now have free speech. What are we going to do? Okay, well, I guess we can talk about IQ differences, I suppose, or something like that. You have to make use of the opportunities when you're granted intellectual liberation, when you have true intellectual freedom, and you have to really give it a chance to bear fruit. But that only comes from formation in the right things, or at least a sense as to where you go to look for the good fruit.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That, as I said, I think politically all good things now are on the other side of scandal, but it doesn't make scandal all that useful because most of the people who have the opportunity or grab the opportunity to say something don't have anything to say. That's one reason why the skepticism, not to say the pessimism, as you said, of Raspai and other major authors is warranted. It's not just that there are people trying to oppress us. It's that there's less and less to oppress from a certain point of view.
Mhm.
The the opportunity for things like the Camp of the Saints is that if ginned up controversy on Amazon gets you to read the book, you'll be amazed by what you discover. There's no novel in America comparable to it, and I think people will also have the sense that nothing like this could be written or published, and wonder why. We think we're free up to a point, and in certain ways that's true, and also it's true that there are very severe limits to this, but there's an opportunity to go beyond them. And one mark of it is the beauty of the work, and one mark of it is the ambition of it. That's one of the strange things about Raspai and authors like him, is that they come after the age of progress, and they think that they have recovered something that progress had lost. People used to speak of progress and have some vision of the completeness of human things, try to give some picture of what it would be like for people to have something worth having fought and conquered for.
Hmm.
And then that was lost. It's people are, so to speak, progressive now all the time. As you're saying, people in go to college because they want progress for themselves, of course, but they presume in a superficial way that somehow everything everywhere could be getting better, must be getting better. But asked, what would that consist in? Nobody could really say. One does not have graduates of prestigious universities who can speak meaningfully about what progress might even mean, or any human question. Contrary-wise, you read about Raspai precisely because he has this interest in the end of an era or of a world or of a way of life or of a culture. He looks for the comprehensive thing. He wants to give you a picture of humanity in its full aspiration. He doesn't waste his time with trivialities. He doesn't waste your time. He would like the writing to be beautiful, but also the picture to have this other sense of beauty that it shows you humanity in an impressive reach. The and I think if you could say why are people opposed to the camp of the saints? I would say that aside from what people might find questionable or in bad taste in the writing, it is the thought that underlies all of it that you have to face certain fundamental conflicts. You find out in a sense what your way of life is if you find anything that you oppose, because now there's a limit and there's a difference, and you have to somehow account for it.
Hmm.
And Raspai tries to give that in the camp of the saints. What was the Western way of life, or what people used to call Western Civ, all about? Now, maybe it's all over, but at least you know what it is. Whereas there are so many people who would say, Western Civ is a good thing, but if you ask them what it is, they would have nothing to say about it.
Yeah,
It's sort of like
give
the
those
American conservative who
bromides
says
to
the silly
critical thought or whatever. Western thinking, Western civilization is just critical thinking, thinking for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. It could end up being this sort of process definition that has no
Yeah,
content.
yeah.
But one could also say, look, I'm shocked that somebody who did a evil production of Shakespeare, it's very ugly. Okay, how many conservatives are going to fund any production of Shakespeare, or scholarship
Mhm.
about Shakespeare, or teaching Shakespeare in schools, or anything? Turns out the number is infinitesimally small. It cannot be detected with current scientific apparatus. It's you end up with this kind of problem that the people who are against it don't quite know what they're against, but if they see it, they will burn it, and other people who are for it will not know what it is if it hits them in the face. To some extent, that's what drives a spy to write something like The Camp of the Saints. Only if you face the end of your way of life will you finally have to be honest about it. That this is your way of life. From the beginning, from the first chapters, this is the theme of the novel. Various characters have to face. Do they even know what it is that they're for or against, as a Western civ or the Western way of life? They have to deal with an alternative, and largely they fail to. They would have to face that you have this way of life, and there are limits to it. And what is on the other side of that is the enemy, actually, because you cannot get along. And so it's,
Mhm.
in one sense, opposed to universalism, but in another sense, it's opposed to a kind of you know, meaninglessness that comes from taking things for granted. You no longer know the difference between the important and the trivial, and so you would not be able to stand up for yourself even if you tried. You don't know for what you're standing up.
Mhm.
As you're saying, the question in that sense is transmission. Since all ways of life depend on transmission, it's not enough to proclaim a principle, because it's not enough to say, I represent something, or I have a representative that represents me and what I stand for. You'd have to say, what do you embody? Way of life, to some extent, means how you actually live. Conflict is supposed to reveal all of that. at the same time. The people who are pretending to be for the Western way of life, the people who are pretending to be against it, there's a lot of ways of being wrong. A lot of what conflict does is clarify things. And through the camp of the saints, you realize most of these characters are insane. They have no idea what they're doing. They're walking
Hmm.
through life confused. This is what is now typical of us.
Yeah,
But
a
for
good
the
way to put
most
it.
part, we assume that confusion just goes on endlessly. But what if it stops, though? Then you would see, okay, actually, there are very real problems, and confusion must be counted among the very important problems we have. The correlative of somebody saying, well, I'm going to ban your book, career, job, business, or oops, it was just a mistake. We're just confused about these things. The correlative of that would be something like maybe welcoming or inviting a catastrophe. The catastrophe in the novel is, from one point of view, immigration, and from the other point of view, a kind of self-hatred
Yeah.
in the various kinds of elites. The Camp of the Saints allows Raspai to look at celebrities, intellectuals, politicians, the Pope, and the rest of the Catholic hierarchy as well. He has quite a range of targets and a searching question for all of them. Do any of these people understand what they believe or do in relation to a plausible, at least, account of their history?
Hmm.
Does the Pope today know what the Pope believed or did 100, 200, or 1,000 years back? He forces people to look into those questions and therefore to establish, is there any kind of continuity? Do we have any kind of awareness from what we experience of the things we say we believe? That is there anything else to being human than saying words?
Hmm.
The and that's somehow again to bring it back to this scandal, but to the idea behind publishing this book again. This kind of scandal makes you ask yourself: is there, even if it's a small thing, does anything really matter? Do you think there's something important here? Does the beauty of the prose or the ugliness of the censorship show you anything? Have you seen something that is more important than people just yapping the mouth? The That's the thing that Raspai is trying to appeal to. That life can't simply be boring, confusing, and it goes on. Partly because it's just not plausible, but partly because artistically it's not interesting. The end of the world is artistically more compelling than boredom and confusion and self-destruction on the installment plan.
Yeah.
The and He bets therefore that there is at least some audience that would have this kind of artistic and moral demand. That I would like some clarity. I see a lot of crazy people. I don't want to go crazy. I would like some clarity about what's going on. At least in the element of the beautiful in storytelling, can we see that? And so you can see he wants you on the one hand to think about the Western way of life as involving the status of individuality.
Mhm.
Individual human beings assert their dignity through all of the objects in their way of life. They want to raise everything to the level of a ritual, and they want that to move on into an inheritance. Whether it's the food or the homes people live in, the things they want to pass on to the next generation, but the way they treat their friends and their occasions of joy and of turmoil, all of these things are supposed to assert the importance of the human being as an individual, not merely as a species. And that
Mhm.
creates a kind of problem. It creates a tension between the what Marx used to call the individual being and the species being.
Mhm.
It is the individualism that creates celebrities and self-seeking in politicians without any kind of responsibility to community. But it also creates the beautiful things. For the beginning of the novel, Raspai has his protagonist, narrator, spectator wonder at Mozart. He says Mozart didn't want to move the masses. He is, in short, no Beethoven, not a barbarian. He wanted
Mhm.
each individual soul to thrill to the music or to enjoy it, and therefore recognize his own humanity. It is the
Yeah.
epitome of being human, and although, or precisely because it is not martial music or particularly political for that matter, it speaks to the
Yeah.
highest ambition of what we call the West. And of
Yeah.
course, Mozart was not French. It says something about Europe, the West, America. It's not entirely tied to any particular political community or in any civilized country. It has to even embrace more than one civilized country, maybe all of them. That is what is opposed to these two things. On the one hand, a million Indian immigrants coming in a fleet in an armada are going to invade southern France. And on the other hand, the elites of France look like they're, and of Europe and to some extent America, look like they're eager for the suicide. The
Yes.
so you get on one side of his understanding of the civilization. On one side of that, you get people who are too poor, too miserable, too suffering to think of themselves as individuals anymore.
Yeah.
Their
Yeah. And
only
that's the key
ability to do
contrast there, I
anything
think.
is in huge, overwhelming numbers where any life and death no longer matters.
Yeah.
Life as such, in some sense, matters, and that's the point that
Yeah.
life out there in the savage world asserts itself. And on the other hand, you have the lifelessness of ideology. There's this weird world of elites who are presented on TV, on the radio, in the newspapers, who depend therefore on modern technologies of communication and on a kind of weird
Yeah.
power for a few people to spellbind an audience. These people somehow are living in a ghostly world of ideology where life means nothing
Yeah.
and they believe it to such an extent that they self-destruct along with bringing on the destruction of France. But
Yeah.
the notion that you could have, on the one hand, some element of living your life, your people, they're French. The French way of life is this. It can include Mozart, it cannot include millions of immigrants from the third world. And on the other hand, there is something that is not merely particular. It's a claim that the human being wants to assert its dignity in beautiful things, in intelligent things, in daring or dangerous things over against the world. There's some need for adventure.
Yeah.
And so that Raspai, even when he brings on the end of the world through the end of France, he still wishes to give you at least a figment, somewhat comic, of the French way of life in a daring band of people who try to defend the French way of life while enjoying it
Yeah.
in this remote house in southern France.
Hmm.
So that's a daring attempt. Is a stark criticism and often shocking prose, but it is neither meaningless nor does it have the uh, gratuitous love of scandal of irresponsible people. He
Yeah.
thinks the scandal is that we would surrender such a thing, and
Mm.
contrariwise, that such a scandal would reveal what is the thing that we might be losing or that we should be defending, contrariwise. Right?
Yeah.
The novel is not a happy end, it's not Hollywood, but the work of publishing it is surely, it bespeaks an intention to not to enlighten people, but to wake them up, to
Yeah.
encourage them to look at themselves and see something both beautiful and endangered.
Yes.
And in that sense, to look at the human condition.
Yeah.
So
To appreciate the fragility and the risk that they're put in by modern circumstances.
that would be my, if I were to say very briefly why somebody should be reading The Camp of the Saints and what he will get out of it, what it means to look at yourself as civilized, endangered, and responsible for things that, in a way, are beyond your control. That
Hmm.
somehow you, as an individual, you have to open up to something much larger that is intelligible, but also that is a community in which you have to act. It's
Yeah.
not abstract. That may be humanism after all. That might be what the practical intention of Raspai as a novelist is. This was one of his early novels. He had a very long career afterwards, of course. It
Hmm.
was written a bit more than 50 years ago. But how do you think about his intention, and how do you think that might speak to the kind of audience that now is listening or can hear that here's an opportunity. Read this.
Well, I actually think what you said is very good. And it's a kind of analysis that I'd bring forth. Look, if you want to read about 1 million migrants arriving on the shores of Europe, that's a daily headline. Now, it actually corresponds with the numbers pretty close to what your average European country has taken, at least in recent years. It's under the numbers the US took, under the numbers Canada took, under the numbers Germany took, about what Britain took in. So you can get the scandal from reading the headlines, the scandal of the novel from reading the headlines. The real value, I think, comes from, you could call it the revelatory character of it. Maybe a eucatastrophe might be the term. The catastrophe can be good, eu, right? Can be good in what it reveals about ourselves and what clarity it gives us. And what I see the value of the book being um, is for that. I think much of our debates about immigration reveal a deeper identity crisis. When people start talking about the immigration policies and so forth, you can see a little bit as to what conception they have of our own society, what they think is wrong with it. You get the left-wing version, which is effectively we're all stained by the white guilt. We have this historic guilt from empires and colonialism or slavery or whatever, and the migrant will heal us from that. We'll be bringing in a more diverse population that will ensure we can leave that era behind. But you often read the right-wing version of this, or at least the center-right version of it, which talks about, oh, the migrants are or want to work very hard and they want to come and help grow the economy. And that shows you basically what that vision of the political community is, which is not a political community, it's a special economic zone. And it also says something about the view of what they think of the people who live there already. Oh, these people are people who live here already. We don't work hard. We're not as good as at founding businesses. We've lost the entrepreneurial spirit. We need it to be renewed by a foreign source, really, because we don't have it anymore. You need the Mexicans to come in with their entrepreneurial spirit because the Americans don't have it anymore. That's kind of the undertone of a lot of this sort of argument, why they frame immigration policy debates in the way that they do, and why they're very supportive of illegal immigration in the American context, because all it really, but the legal categorization, citizenship, how you enter the country, that stuff doesn't matter. What matters is just the raw economic output that you come here to do. Uh, and that's so there's a pernicious strand that is caught up in that argument. But for our purposes, I think it's valuable just to see how in these debates about immigration, you see so much as to raise as to who we are. It's really the way that this question gets posed, and it presupposes so much when people start advocating their policies. You see what is presupposed in their conversation. So Camp of the Saints is valuable because I think it's a novel, as we said, is really about our own civilizational malaise, our own desire for suicide in many ways. And you see that in a lot of discussions about immigration. And what presenting the novel does, I hope, is give you the chance to see that so much of the immigration debate is wrapped up in this crisis of identity, this crisis of who we are and how we understand ourselves. And it's a bipartisan crisis. There's the left-wing version, the political correct version that excises a lot of conservatives, but then they have their own version often when they go to talk about immigration reform, where they talk about more of the reduce humanity to the economic element. And you have to strive for something greater than that, I think. And the insight of the romantic movement is precisely that. Don't let yourself be cabined or cribbed by materialism. Don't let yourself be cabined or cribbed by a script written elsewhere at another time. You can defy it, and in your struggle against that, you can rise to a higher, truly human understanding, and you can grasp the noble when other people tell you it doesn't exist or offer you counterfeit versions of it. So there are other difficulties with the romantic tradition, of course, but that's a particularly valuable part of it, I think, to recognize that there's a path to participation with something that is higher than just the mundane part that is around you. Um,
Yeah, I think that's a very important insight that from a certain point of view, it looks like the left wing and the right wing visions are progressive because they offer, for example, growth in a certain sense. But in another way, they're quite depressive, as you were saying.
yeah,
They're built on saying, look, we've looked at ourselves and it's just not worth it. It's just not going to work. Only foreigners can fix things.
yeah,
Maybe for moral reasons and the reparations, maybe for economic reasons, both maybe. But the premise is our way of life, indefensible, impractical. It's just there's nothing left to believe in or do. And compared to that, crazy as it might sound, romanticism is actually quite hopeful and humane. And the Tolkien phrase you use, the eucatastrophe, the catastrophe that leads to some kind of happy end, it does seem more human because now and then you do get to survive a fight to the death or something like that. Being in danger of your life is not the worst thing. In fact, there was a time when progressive liberals were, kind of silly feminists like John Stuart Mill would still say war is an evil, but it's not the worst thing. The cowardice that would mean that you wouldn't even fight a war, that is the worst thing.
yeah,
And in some ways, Raspa is trying to show that to people by
yeah,
forcing them as readers to take sides, but also encouraging them not to give up on themselves. And so I
mhm,
think that as a writer and in terms of offering a narrator, he's much better able to speak to the moment and to this other aspect of something like a scandal on social media. There's a lot of social media, but only one of them really matters, and that's X because that's where the controversy is. Everything else, it just
mhm,
seems like it's sunk into triviality or ideology or both. But on X, there's some kind of fight, and therefore there's a kind of human type, which is young men looking for something noble. I think something worth fighting for that has to have the character of having images and words attached to it that could speak to maybe a majority of the American people ultimately.
yeah,
That's the stakes, that's the character of the conflict, and that's where somebody like Raspail can speak to people. It's something that the great French literary tradition can contribute to America, and in a way would have to, since most of these things are unpublishable or unwritable in America. Maybe this could be our closing subject for this conversation. There are many other things to talk about, including your work on actually existing post-liberalism, but we'll have to do most of that in another episode. But for a closing subject, it has struck me now and then that of the countries that used to call the free world or republics or civilized places, only the French seem to have some kind of thriving cultural life. There's a diktat against talented people in America. It's a lot worse in England. Germany used to have thinkers, and I mean, it ended up with, I guess, Jürgen Habermas or something, and he's dead
mhm,
now too. So even when it was mediocre, it was this. Uh, France has more novelists, essayists, cultural shows than I think any other place. And that struck me, partly because, of course, we were used to, from the 20th century or the mid-century, identifying French thought with the left, crazy revolutionary Marxists or people play acting it. But it's not just Raspail, or I think our friends at Vauban are also publishing Michéa and Renaud Camus. But there are any number of people, like the people I know and admire, like Chantal Delsol and Pierre Manon and Remy Brague. There's people like Olivier Rey, I think he's making a kind of noise and kind of criticism of where things are going in France. And one could name quite a number of other people, and there are no correlatives to that in either Europe or America. There's something
mhm.
about France that allowed them to speak more openly and more beautifully at the same time. They're, the Just to give the example of immigration, everybody heard of Welbeck because he wrote Submission in 2015. Well, the same year, Scruton, not an unknown name, also published a novel about immigrants raping people and doing horrifying things in England. Nobody has ever heard of that novel. It's called It Disappeared, by the way. You know, there's like three places in America maybe reviewed it because Scruton was always more popular in America than in England, but it suddenly disappeared. Obviously, Scruton was not half the novelist Welbeck is, but I don't think that's somehow the explanation. I think that in a strange way, there's more free speech in France than in England, in some ways than in America, and there's more interest in scandalous things, I guess. Again, there's
Yeah.
people were aware that some of Raspail's novels were scandalous. People were aware that everything Welbeck says is scandalous, including his poetry. But that's to some extent part of the interaction. But I can't think of any other place like that. So, do you have any thoughts, since you've had so much experience and interest in France, about what is it that makes them more open to controversy, to interesting ideas, if not immune, at least less susceptible to this sort of ideological diktat, conformism, and censorship?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with being marked by a deep political suffering on the one hand, and then on the other hand, having a sense of a greater political imagination. More regime types existed in France in the past 200 years than in other places. Yes, yes, the Germans and such had theirs, but you have to remember too that much of the project, I say in Germany and Italy, was built around national unity, which is a 19th century phenomenon. And so it was baked into a lot of the efforts there, putting those countries on a particular arc and putting their literature and their storytelling on that arc. In Germany, it ended in catastrophe. Germans have never really been able to grapple with the legacy of that, I think, which is a big challenge that that country has, or at least has never been able to get out of the shadow of the Second World War. Instead, it started imposing that on other countries, forced them to adopt the same script. The Italian version of it was a very secular project that never really, I think, connected with the internal divides and led to a lot of there are obviously very insightful people like Augusto Del Noce, but a lot of it ended up being a desire to imitate the most successful secular nationalist project of the 20th century, which was the American Progressive one. So when I read someone like Umberto Eco, I see someone who's deeply knowledgeable about the past, about the medieval period. It really knows the details of it, very philosophically informed, and yet he's enchanted by an imaginary of we're going to leave the era of the church behind, we're going to move forward. Um, and the French experience is different because they've had that encounter, and those kinds of thinkers, even if people disagree with them politically, still appreciate them. Joseph de Maistre, widely appreciated across the political spectrum and read up until recently. Charles Maurras, also praised by Georges Pompidou in the 1970s, as which is unfathomable today. I would say though, I as much as anyone idealize France and appreciate it, but I think it is important to see that Braque, Del Sol, Manon, um, they're they're the members of a generation. I don't think they're the last, but the May 68 mentality, as elsewhere, really did limit the scope of what is possible. So the young people can grasp that there's something more, but they have to punch through that barrier. And that's very, very hard. Every country has a version of that barrier. But punching through that barrier is very, very hard for young people in France. And so I think what's funny now about the French tradition, and I think it frustrates someone like French politics, I should say, it frustrates someone like Eric Zemmour, whose book Le Suicide Français I just translated immensely, is that now you have a kind of right-wing French populism that is in a way uprooted from a cultural milieu. The leader of the movement has an American name, Jordan Bardella, Jordan, right? It's an odd irony, and yet it reflects this barrier that has been put down across the political landscape. Marine Le Pen, they're not people of culture. They're not transmitting that. They have a kind of populist spirit, and that spiritedness should be commended, but they are cut off from their past in a serious way. And I think the real question facing France going forward, and I think it faces every European country, is whether you can knock that barrier down and reconnect, whether those who are under 50 can do that. I think under 30, especially when the spirit's still there, or whether they just accept that and march along in a kind of plodding pace towards the bureaucratic conformity that is the European Commission and accept that as their ultimate identity. And that's a real danger. And so I think a lot of what Americans can offer France and Europe right now, especially the younger Americans, is their energy. We can bring that into their scene. We can show them we're doing this and this and this. We can show them that we're interested in their thinkers who they're not allowed to read anymore. Ernst Junger, Schmidt, Maurras. You pick your mestre, right? Pick your thinker. Who didn't pass the muster of the curriculum when it was written by the 68, right? Uh, and the and it's simply to put those texts back on the table for discussion. It's not to say you agree with every one of them. In fact, that would be impossible because they say different things. But it's just to put that offering back, that platter back up, help them punch through the barrier. And I think that's the role that Americans can play right now in bringing their energy to the European scene and saying you don't have to let Brussels and the European Commission define your whole civilization, where the best you can hope for is an identity defined in contrast to Russia. That's all that's available for you. Defining yourself by your enemy is not a recipe for a fruitful, rich civilization. So that's what we have to offer, and it's I think a decisive moment. The next decade is very important to be able to do that. If we fail to do that, I think a lot of that tradition will genuinely vanish and disappear, or will become a kind of esoteric thing and not really a living one that's viewed more as a relic and as a subject of, I don't know, a librarian rather than something that is rich and vital that actually generates excitement. So those are the stakes, I think, right now in the
Yeah,
transit
I
that
think
we're
that's
in.
very well put. That I hear this from European friends. I was recently in France, and I heard this from some of my friends there that really there's nothing like American energy, American logistics, that often noted, sometimes mocked, can-do attitude that really makes the difference. And to some extent, the fact that this, the camp of the saints is coming to America. It's both about what France has to offer America and what America has to offer France, actually, in Europe. And I do hear this increasingly from my younger French friends in their 20s or 30s, that they pay a lot more attention to America. And I sometimes see them quoting Anglo authors where they would have quoted perhaps French authors even a generation back. So there's a huge influence, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And I agree with you that it will soon be decided, since the orientation, the possibilities for this generation will be decided fairly soon. That's in a way, that's the Raspai question: is culture going to survive, or is it over? It could go either way. Ways of life disappear. Awareness of that could make you look for what's most vital, or it could make you pine, I suppose, in a romantic way, or maybe even in a certain progressive mood, turn nihilist, since the past can die, it should die. It's there are a number of different orientations one could take to this while appreciating the richness of the work. But it is the question, it is the way people look at things now, since there is, the urgency of political drama in America is ultimately about that, the fear that ways of life can expire, that history could have its revenge on America, and that we should somehow avoid that fate.
Yeah,
That's even awareness about that, the kind of richer awareness that comes when you reflect on a worthy work of art is worth a lot. And what follows or what will happen afterwards, of course, incalculable. But it is the case that the political fight and in a way the fight for civilization is much more alive in America, much more engaged than anywhere else. And one hopes that this also means this kind of inspiration or this kind of help for other civilized places or places that would like to reclaim their civilization. So, Nathan, thank you very much for joining me. I'm glad to see that all of this work is getting out there. It's actually getting an audience and it will have influence. And let's do another show. We've broached a couple of subjects that we could talk about in relation to your work. Uh, we will try, Pascal and I, to have you on the show sometime soon and talk more about the Euro-American drama from some cultural point of view that is timely.
wonderful. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And all the best until next time, then.
All
Bye
best.
bye.